How can we now continue towards identifying patterns? One interesting technique for doing this is to write down these relationships in a so-called footprint matrix. Here you see the example of a footprint matrix. You see that this footprint matrix has columns which are called A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and it has rows which have the same names. So it is a quadratic matrix. How do we fill the cells in this matrix? Each cell is showing the relationship that we have identified for the corresponding pair of activities. If you look, for instance, at the cell in row A, column B, you will see that there is an arrow pointing rightwards. This says that there is a causal relationship from A being followed by B. In this way, we can enter all those relationships that we have found into this matrix. The nice thing is that we can inspect now this matrix to identify patterns. There's also one thing that is important to note for the matrix, that the matrix is symmetric. This means that when we look at the cell AB, that the cell BA shows the same information. This means in row A, column B, we find an arc that is pointing rightwards, and in row B, column A, we see an arc that is pointing leftwards. And if you take the diagonal of the matrix, you will always find the same information on the right upper side and on the left lower side. Now, the next step is to take this matrix and to identify patterns of behavior from it. That is then the basis for the alpha algorithm to construct the process model. In essence, there are 5 different patterns that we try to identify from the footprint matrix. The first thing, it's the very basic behavior, and that is the sequence. The sequence is a very simple and basic pattern, and it can easily be identified from the footprint matrix. In essence, every time we find a sequence, we find in our matrix a causal relationship between activities. There are many examples here in this matrix that we see, just one instance of it being highlighted. There's also more interesting patterns of behavior which are meaningful and important for process models. They essentially relate to XOR splits and joins and to AND split and joins. Also, those types of behavior have certain patterns that we can identify in the footprint matrix. Let's start with the XOR split. So this is essentially a pattern of choice. With an XOR split, we essentially identify that there's one activity, let's call it A, that is followed by another activity, and that there's also a causal relationship to a third activity. Beyond that, these 2 subsequent activities are in an exclusiveness relationship. That means from A we can either continue with B or we can continue with C, but we cannot continue with both. They are exclusive. This is a pattern that we can identify in our matrix based on the help of 3 different cells. We essentially need to identify those rows where we have arcs pointing rightwards in our matrix, and these would be relating to cells that are exclusive to one another. You see one of those instances being highlighted in the example here. The same idea can also be used to identify XOR joins. When we would observe an XOR join, in essence we need again 3 activities. Let them be called activities B, C, and D. And the relationships that we would expect between them is that B is directly leading to D, and that C is also directly leading to D, and that we would expect B and C to be exclusive to one another. In our case, we do not have an instance of that example here, but if you look at the matrix, you will find a counterexample that is worth to be discussed. If we look at column E, we find that we have 2 cases where an arc is pointing rightwards. That relates to B, that leads to E, and that is relating to C, that relates to E. This would be an instance of an XOR join if the corresponding relationship between B and C would be exclusive. You see highlighted that this is actually not the case. The relationship between B and C is that of concurrency. Now let's have a look how this works with AND splits and joins. The idea is quite the similar one. We again look at 3 different activities, and we would expect that we see concurrency between them, at least partially. This means, in this case of the AND split, that we have activity A followed by either B or C, and that B and C are concurrent to one another. For this case, we also have an example highlighted in the matrix. So now let's have a look, finally, how this works with the AND join. We have two activities, B or C, and they would both causally lead towards another activity, let's call it D. Now we would have a pattern that this is an AND join if B and C would be concurrent to one another, and they both lead to activity D. Also for this, we have an example here in our matrix.